What if I told you that the face of Jesus, is wrong? For nearly 2,000 years, one image has dominated the world. A man with long, flowing brown hair, fair skin, a thin nose, and gentle, often blue, eyes. He is serene, beautiful, and ethereal. This is the face on church walls, in priceless paintings, and in millions of homes. But is this the real face of Jesus? Or is it one of history's most powerful and enduring artistic inventions? The truth, buried by centuries of art, culture, and tradition, is far more complex, far more human, and far more fascinating than you could ever imagine. What did the most influential man in human history actually look like? The answer is not found in a single painting, but in a trail of clues that spans archaeology, forensic science, and the hidden gaps in the text that define him. To find the real face, we must first understand the origin of the face we already know. The popular image of Jesus is not an eyewitness account. It's an evolution. Its journey begins in the Byzantine Empire centuries after Jesus' death. Early Christians, living in a Roman world, were hesitant to depict him at all. They used symbols: a fish, a shepherd, a lamb. But as Christianity became the religion of the empire, they needed an image of power. They modeled their Jesus on the depictions of their gods and emperors. They created the Christ Pantocrator, the ruler of all. This image showed a bearded, long-haired man, regal and divine, staring down from the domes of cathedrals. This wasn't a historical portrait, it was a theological statement. This divine template was then inherited by the great masters of the Renaissance. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Albrecht Dürer lived in a world that celebrated a specific standard of European beauty. When they painted Salvator Mundi or The Last Supper, they weren't trying to be historians. They were artists expressing their devotion, and they did so by painting a man who looked like the people in their world. Dürer even famously used his own features as the model for Christ. In the 20th century, this European image was cemented in the global consciousness by Hollywood films and, most famously, by Warner Sallman's 1940 painting, The Head of Christ. This painting, with its soft focus and gentle, almost Nordic features, became the definitive image for hundreds of millions of people. It was reproduced over 1 billion times. But all these images, from the Byzantine domes to the modern prayer card, are based on artistic tradition, not historical fact. They are interpretations. So, to find the real man, we must strip away the layers of art and ask a simple question: what do we actually know? The strangest and most important clue is the silence. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the primary accounts of Jesus' life. They describe what he said in minute detail. They describe his miracles, his travels, his emotions. They tell us what he ate, where he slept, and who he argued with. But in thousands of words, not one single verse describes his physical appearance. Not his height, not his hair color, not the color of his eyes. Nothing. This silence is deafening. Why would the authors leave out the one detail we crave the most? Many scholars believe this omission was deliberate. To the gospel writers, Jesus' physical appearance was completely irrelevant. What mattered was his message, his identity, and his resurrection. By not describing him, they made him universal. He wasn't defined by his human features, but by his divine mission. There is, however, one cryptic clue found not in the Gospels but in the writings of the prophet Isaiah, which Christians have long interpreted as a prophecy of the coming Messiah. Isaiah 53 verse 2 states, "He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him." If this passage is taken literally, it suggests the very opposite of the beautiful man in the paintings. It suggests Jesus was, in fact, remarkably ordinary. He was unremarkable, average, a man who could blend into a crowd. This makes historical sense. In the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus returns to his hometown of Nazareth, the people are not amazed by his godlike appearance. They're baffled. They say, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary?" They saw him as one of them, a local craftsman, and they couldn't comprehend where he got his newfound wisdom. This ordinariness is even used as a plot point. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, they cannot pick him out of the small group of disciples. Judas Iscariot must identify him with a kiss. He didn't stand out. He wasn't the 6-foot-tall, radiant figure of the paintings. He looked just like his followers. So who was he? What did a man from first-century Galilee look like? Here, we leave art and theology and turn to science. Archaeology, anthropology, and forensics have given us a picture that is startlingly different from the traditional image. First, the location. Jesus was a Galilean Jew from Nazareth. This region was part of the Middle East under Roman occupation. The people were of Semitic heritage. This means he almost certainly had features common to the people of that region today: olive skin, dark brown or black hair, and dark brown eyes. The idea of a fair-skinned, blue-eyed savior is a complete and geographically impossible artistic invention. Second, his profession. The Gospels call him a tekton. This is often translated as carpenter, but the Greek word is much broader. It means a craftsman, a builder, an artisan. He likely worked with wood, stone, and possibly metal. This was not delicate work. This was hard, physical labor, outdoors, under a hot Middle Eastern sun. He would have been strong, sinewy, and weathered. His body would have been that of a laborer, not the soft, delicate figure of Renaissance art. His height would have been typical for the time. Skeletal remains from first-century Judea show the average male height was around 5 feet 5 inches. But what about his face? This is where the most groundbreaking work has been done. In 2001, a team of British and Israeli scientists, led by forensic anthropologist Dr. Richard Neve, set out to reconstruct the face of a first-century Galilean man. They couldn't use Jesus' skull, as none exists. Instead, they did the next best thing. They obtained 3 well-preserved Semitic skulls from first-century Jerusalem, the very time and place Jesus lived. Using computerized tomography, CT scans, they created 3D printed replicas of the skulls. From here, they applied the established methods of forensic reconstruction. They used specialized software to calculate the likely tissue depth on the face, based on data from modern populations in the region. They rebuilt the facial muscles layer by layer to determine the fundamental shape of the nose, the cheeks, and the jaw. The result was a face that stunned the world. It was broad, with a prominent nose, dark olive skin, and a strong jaw. It was the face of a first-century Middle Eastern man. To complete the portrait, they had to address the hair. Most paintings showed Jesus with long, flowing locks parted in the middle. But this, too, is likely wrong. The Apostle Paul, a contemporary, wrote in a letter to the Corinthians, "Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him?" Paul was speaking to a Greek audience, but his words reflect the norms of the time. Long hair on men was not the Jewish custom. Instead, the team looked at archaeological evidence. Frescoes and mosaics from first-century synagogues and tombs in the region consistently show men with short, tightly curled, or woolly black hair and a neat but full beard, as was the Jewish tradition. When the team combined all this data, the skull structure, the skin tone, the short, curly hair, and the beard, they produced a portrait. This is not, they are clear, the exact face of Jesus. But it is the most scientifically accurate, data-driven approximation we have. It is the face of a man who could have lived in that time and that place. It is a face that is strong, weathered, and distinctly Middle Eastern. This forensic image forces us to see him in a new light, not as a distant, ethereal king, but as a man of the earth, a man who looked like his neighbors, who worked with his hands, who walked the dusty roads of Galilee, and who was, in his appearance, utterly human. But what about the relics? For centuries, believers have pointed to artifacts that they claim hold the true image of Jesus. The most famous and most controversial is the Shroud of Turin. This long, linen cloth bears the faint, ghostly image of a crucified man. The image is a photographic negative, and it shows wounds that are astonishingly consistent with the gospel accounts of the crucifixion, including marks from a crown of thorns, a spear wound in the side, and scourge marks on the back. The man on the shroud, however, does not match the forensic reconstruction. He is tall, between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet 2 inches, and his features, though Semitic, are long and noble, much closer to the traditional paintings. Believers see this as definitive proof of the resurrection, an image burned onto the cloth at the moment of divine power. Science, however, remains deeply skeptical. In 1988, 3 separate laboratories conducted radiocarbon dating on a sample of the shroud. All 3 concluded with 95% certainty that the cloth originated in the Middle Ages, somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. This date, for skeptics, makes the shroud a brilliant but human-made medieval forgery. Believers, however, challenge this result. They argue the sample was contaminated by medieval repairs, or that a fire in 1532 skewed the carbon data. The debate rages on. The Shroud of Turin remains one of history's most profound and unsolvable mysteries, a testament to faith, but not a conclusive historical document. Another important but lesser-known relic is the Mandelion, or the image of Edessa. According to ancient legend, this was a cloth pressed to Jesus' face while he was alive, which miraculously retained his image. This image not made by human hands became the prototype for all Byzantine icons. It was this relic, not an eyewitness sketch, that created the long-haired, bearded look that the Renaissance artists would later inherit. The Mandelion, however, was lost to history, disappearing after the sack of Constantinople in 1204. So, both history and science point to one conclusion. The real face of Jesus looked almost nothing like the images we see in art. The historical Jesus was a first-century Semitic man, short, strong, with olive skin, dark eyes, and short, curly black hair. But does this discovery mean that every other face of Jesus is wrong? Here, we move from history to a deeper truth. The reason the popular image of Jesus has endured is not because it is historically accurate, but because it is culturally powerful. For centuries, every culture that has embraced Christianity has seen Jesus in its own image. In Ethiopia, art depicts a black Jesus with African features. In Korea, Jesus is painted with the robes and features of a Korean scholar. In Latin America, his image is fused with indigenous and local traditions. This is not a failure of history. It is a profound theological success. The real face of Jesus is not a static, single image. It is a mirror. Each culture, each person sees in him the reflection of the divine in their own humanity. The message was that God became human, and so he could be seen in all humans. This brings us to the final and most important face of Jesus. It is not a face we can reconstruct with forensics, and it is not a face we can find on a medieval cloth. It is the face he describes in his own teachings. The Gospels, while silent on his physical appearance, are crystal clear about his character, his priorities, and his identity. The real face of Jesus is the face of compassion. It is the face that looked at the woman caught in adultery, not with judgment, but with forgiveness, saying, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." The real face of Jesus is the face of righteous anger. It is the face that confronted the money changers in the temple, overturning their tables, enraged by the exploitation of the poor in a house of worship. The real face of Jesus is the face of radical inclusion. It is the face that touched the untouchable leper, that ate dinner with the despised tax collector, and that elevated the status of women and children in a society that saw them as property. And ultimately, it is the face of sacrificial love, the face on the cross, which prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This is the face that launched a global movement. It wasn't the shape of his nose or the color of his eyes. It was the revolutionary power of his ideas, that the poor are blessed, that the meek will inherit the earth, and that the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Perhaps the most direct answer Jesus ever gave about his real face is found in the Gospel of Matthew, in the parable of the sheep and the goats. When the righteous ask the king when they ever saw him, he replies, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." This is the final answer. The real face of Jesus is not in a painting. It is not in a museum. It is not buried in the past. It is the face of the poor, the face of the sick, the face of the prisoner, the face of the refugee, the face of the person right in front of you who needs help. The quest for the historical face of Jesus is a fascinating human endeavor. The forensic reconstruction gives us a powerful, tangible connection to the man who lived 2,000 years ago, shattering our Eurocentric illusions and grounding him in his true historical context. But it is not the end of the journey. The real face of Jesus is not one we are meant to find, but one we are meant to be. It is not an image to be passively adored, but a life to be actively emulated. The face of Jesus is not a mystery to be solved. It is a challenge to be lived.